Hey guys, welcome back to History 240. A couple housekeeping things real quick. Overall, not a bad job on your test. Congratulations. For some of you, I can tell it was a little harder than maybe what you were expecting. But we did have some fairly good grades overall. So I wanted to say good job and congratulations on that. Up to this point, grading is up to date for all of the items that I had, including items in my inbox. So if you get onto your Blackboard and you notice that maybe there's a mistake or there's something on there that shouldn't be, make sure you get a hold of me so I can get that fixed. I am human, and I was working on those really, really late the other night. So after a little while, hello, Oscar. It's my cat, Oscar. After a little while, I tend to lose track of things, so just make sure you guys let me know if there's some kind of issue with your grades, and I'll get that fixed. Beyond that, that's pretty much all the housekeeping stuff. So along with my wonderful cat, Oscar, you guys can see behind me, I have this wonderful mess behind me. I'm still moving in over here in Lexington, and I'm starting to get to the point where the majority of my house is clean, but my office is still a horrendous mess, and it's become like the catch-all, so please forgive the mess. So with that, we'll get started on our historical discussion for the evening. This is really exciting and kind of cool. We get to talk about butchers and why Kentucky is seen as both a Confederate state and a Union state. Before we do any of that, I want you guys to pause this video and go to the YouTube videos that I've posted on the PowerPoint, because those are generalizations about the Civil War. Because I'm a medievalist, I have very poor notions of what the Civil War is really about, and these videos explain it much better than I could. So there are points when, as a historian, you have to look at yourself and say, I'm really not well versed in this. I better find somebody else who is, and point people in that direction. And that's part of what it means to be a historian. So go ahead and watch those videos, take some notes on it, and we'll kind of go from there after that. So I'm going to assume that you guys have watched your videos, and now that you've done that, we can talk about other things that are specific to Kentucky with the Civil War instead of on a national front. So let's get to it. Let me pull that up real quick. Okay, so in Kentucky with the Civil War, you see this notion that the state is really torn because it's a border state. And with this notion of brother against brother is a really common sentiment. And legitimately, the Civil War was a war where brothers and family members and uncles and cousins were all fighting against each other. But it's particularly prominent in border states like Kentucky. You hear sayings all the time about how the Civil War was a particularly, maybe genial kind of war, just from the fact that, you hear stories of Confederate soldiers yelling over to Union soldiers and saying, "We're getting ready to fire, so duck your heads," or times when Union soldiers would do something particularly nice for Confederate soldiers. The nursing staff and the Union doctors would treat both Union members and Confederate members after a battle. Things like that. They pop up all the time. And a lot of this stems from the fact that you might have a single family that has a father go to one side and his two sons go to the other side, or one brother go to one side and another brother go to another side, or anything along those lines. and that's really a particularly strong sentiment in Kentucky. Um, and it's really derisive for families during this time. But beyond that, there are other thoughts associated with the Civil War, and it's important to become familiar with those because they will lead into greater issues during the Reconstruction. So just keep these things in mind. If you guys have a few minutes and you think it might be a good idea, you could always do your primary source document analysis on Civil War diaries, and those will really give you a good idea about the kind of sentiments we're talking about here. But beyond that, there are 20 major battles fought in Kentucky. Hello again, Oscar. There are several prominent Kentuckians associated with the Civil War. So mainly John Hunt Morgan, Abraham Lincoln and his wife Mary Todd, and Jefferson Davis. And Kentucky's split is really based on economic ties between the North, hello, and geographic ties to the South. So they have both of these biases that are pulling at them. And they really can't make up their mind about what exactly they're going to do. Now, Oscar, you can't get up here on my computer. Go over there. Sorry, guys. Highlight of the night. I pushed my cat into a laundry basket. So, let me go on from there. Where did my mouse go? Here it is. Okay, hopefully that worked. Yeah, we're still rolling here. Okay. There we go. So, politics of the Civil War. So, we talked last time we had lecture together about the rise of the Whigs and about some of the prominent figures in Whig politics. Well, with the beginning of the Civil War, and even before this, the Whigs as a political entity are going to decline. And they're going to side with Democrats who are very liberal, New Republicans who are very conservatives, know-nothings, or people who are nativists, so they are kind of opposed to immigration and those kinds of things. People coming in from other countries and trying to become nationalized. They're completely opposed to this. There are also constitutional union parties who are mainly against secession, but still hold to a literal reading of the Constitution. And in fact, they'll take the state in 1860 under John Bell for president. But they don't gain a whole lot of power throughout this. But Kentucky Governor Beriah Magoffin thought that southern states had been violated in some way, and that they had the right to leave the Union under something called secession, which is where one thing separates from another. So they're essentially separating from the Union. And the Kentucky General Assembly has very deep unionistic sympathies. So they're going to ignore all of the government's requests to assemble and decide on whether or not they're going to leave the Union. So they completely ignore them. They want to say, we want nothing to do with this, and if we ignore the problem, it'll just go away. But that's not really what's happening in reality. So what they'll do is they'll send 6 delegates to the National Convention that's held February 4th in 1860 to try to find potential compromises. And this will lead to kind of the backing of the Crittenden Compromise. It's put together by John Crittenden. And at this point, it's not doing them any good because there are already several states that have left the Union. So it's not like they can go and support this compromise and have it do any real substantial good because the Civil War's already essentially started. But it'll propose 4 amendments to the Constitution and 6 amendments to the Constitution and 4 congressional resolutions. And they are kind of deciding the kind of direction of the country as far as slave states go. So slaves will be okay in the current slave states. They can keep their slaves. They can keep the slave trade going. And they can even keep them in D.C. And if Virginia and Maryland have slaves and they are made into free states, then they'll be compensated if a slave makes it into a free state, or they refuse to bring them back. So with this, there will also be a fugitive slave law that'll be more heavily enforced, but will again get compensation for slaves. So let's say, for example, a slave runs away from Kentucky and goes into Ohio. That slave would be allowed his freedom, but the slave owner would be compensated, and he'll be paid for the fact that that slave has run away. But on the flip side of this, with personal liberty laws, let's say you've got a slave and his master, his owner, and they go into an area where it's just a federal territory and they've not decided on whether it's been a free state or a slave state yet. The idea of personal liberty, the slaves at this point cannot sue for their freedom in these areas, even if it's a free area, because there's no sense of personal liberty. They're not citizens, so they can't sue anyone for their freedom. And this is formalized in the Dred Scott case. And then again, there's a little bit of trade suppression, so they'll still be a slave trade, but it will be suppressed. They won't be able to trade in certain ways. So they won't be able to trade necessarily between states and those kinds of things. And then beyond that, under the Crittenden Compromise, they'll extend the Missouri Compromise line, which you guys should have heard about in your videos. And this cannot be repealed or amended. It's very popular with Southerners, but it's not popular at all with Northern abolitionists. So, you know, these things will be highly unsuccessful, and a lot of this is because the North is such a numerical superior area that, you know, there's no way for the Southerners to, or the North to give the kind of support that this compromise needs to be effective, if that makes sense. So we go into the Civil War. So Kentucky is the only Union state to ever have its capital taken by a Confederate army. And with this, because Kentucky is a border state, it knows it's going to have battles. And because Magoffin is a very staunch supporter of the South, but the General Assembly is not, he will refuse to send troops to either side. That being said, it's a highly strategic location. It's got the Ohio River for the south, it's got crops for the north. This includes tobacco, wheat, corn, the things that they need to basically survive. So, in fall of 1861, both sides want the strategic locations along the river. So General Leonidas Polk will take Columbus, Kentucky on September 3rd, 1861, to prevent Columbus, Kentucky from being captured by the Union, even though it's already in a Union state. I don't know. So the Union under Grant will take Paducah and Southland on September 6th and put Kentuckians largely on the Union side of this. So the majority of Kentuckians who are in places like Paducah and those areas will be more likely to back the Union Army in this. And during the war, there'll be 50,000 white soldiers who go into the Union Army and 24,000 black soldiers. That's 74,000 people going into the Union Army. Unfortunately for the Confederate States, there will only be 35,000 who will join the Confederate States of America. So let's talk about Frankfort. I told you guys that Kentucky is the only state that's technically a northern state, a Union state, that will be taken by the Confederate Army. So when we go into September of 1862, there'll be a plot to pull the Union Army from Chattanooga at the railroad station in Chattanooga, Tennessee. So what will happen is Southern troops will converge on Frankfort, and they will try to capture Frankfort, and they'll succeed. So you'll have Governor James Robinson, who will flee to Louisville with his cabinet and a few of the state legislatures on September 2nd of 1892. They take the state records, they take the state archives, and they set up a temporary government in Louisville. On the 3rd, Colonel John Scott of the 1st Louisiana Cavalry will reach Frankfort. They were recent victors at the Battle of Richmond. And what they'll do is he'll send members of his regiment to take down the Union flag at the Capitol, and he'll put up his regiment flag there at the Capitol. And then from there, Scott and his men on 450 fresh horses will attack the Union men retreating toward Louisville, following behind Governor James Robinson. Now, the next day, Scott will skirmish near Shelbyville, and then he will return to Frankfort. And they'll camp there for a couple days from the 6th to the 7th, and then move to Lebanon, Kentucky. On a month later, in October in 1862, the Confederate General Braxton Bragg and Edmund Kirby Smith, with a few other officers and around 12,000 troops, and will come into Frankfort for the inauguration speech of Richard Hawes, and he'll become the provisional governor of the Confederate States of Kentucky, and he'll be preceded by George Johnson after the Kentucky Convention. So with this, you can see why there's a large amount of pull between the two areas in Kentucky. So you'll have a lot of pull going the southern way, and you'll have a lot of pull going the northern way. But a lot of it boils down to, again, this kind of super hyper polarized atmosphere that surrounded Kentucky. But shortly after this, Union troops will reorganize in Louisville and then push the Confederates out. So the Confederate state, which is never formally recognized by the United States, will move their provisional capital to Bowling Green, and this will be the Confederate capital. The Union capital will remain in Frankfort. The Confederate capital never gets any kind of citizen backing, and Kentucky will be added to the Confederate state in December of 1861, but they never seceded, so they never had one of their stars removed from the Union flag either. It remains a Union state, despite also being a Confederate state. So after this, because of the kind of movement and the military situation going on in Kentucky. The provisional government for the Confederacy will remain with the Army of Tennessee, and a lot of times they'll be over in Tennessee, so they won't actually stay in Kentucky all that often. But it will still be the provisional government of Kentucky for the Confederate States of America. And then just a quick thing about the Russellville Convention. And this will happen on December 29th of 1861, and you'll have 63 delegates from 34 counties at Russellville. And they will attempt to have Kentucky secede from the Union, and they will ratify the succession, keep the current laws of Kentucky, and they'll set up a hierarchy of government. So they'll tell they'll tell you who's kind of in charge of the government and where they sit. They'll create a new seal, which I've included here with the Voce Populi, the Voce Populi means by the voice of the people, which this really doesn't represent necessarily the voice of the people, because most of them, as you guys can see, will be Union supporters. But it's still the common thought that it is the voice of the people, because a portion of the people will support it. And then they'll set up a new capital, and that will be just about it. So moving on from there, and this is the last slide, guys. So I know we've had a really kind of short lecture tonight. Hopefully this will give you guys a good break after last week's big test. But let's talk about one last guy, and then I'll let you guys go for the evening. So towards the end of the Civil War, Lincoln will declare martial law throughout all of Kentucky. And Major General Stephen Burbridge will be given command of all of Kentucky. His job is to suppress disloyalty. He will use economic pressure as coercion to suppress this disloyalty. So he will say, I will stop buying things from your place unless you remain loyal, if that makes sense. And most of this won't be generally stores or things like that. It'll be other economic pressures. But he had a very well-known policy in Kentucky that didn't really gain a lot of prominence throughout the rest of the United States, but will become well-known rather quickly. And what has happened at this point? By 1864, when Order number 59 is established, Order number 59, you'll see more and more deserters coming into Kentucky. You'll see more people going back to their old lifestyles. You'll see people coming back from the war. And they'll still have these political ties to whichever side they were fighting for when they were still at war. So with this, they'll band together in like these little guerrilla pockets, and they'll come in and they'll attack and they'll kill Union citizens and Union soldiers. So under Order number 59, this was Burbridge's policy for guerrillas. So he had captured several of these guerrillas at this point. And he stated that for each unarmed Union citizen's death, he would execute 4 guerrillas. So every single time someone died who was a citizen of Kentucky, he would find and choose 4 citizens who were also former guerrillas, and he would execute them. And for that, he is known as the Butcher of Kentucky. So, with that, I bid you all a good night, and I hope you guys enjoyed this one. This one was short, sweet, and to the point. It's only 24 minutes long. Yay! So have a good night. Good luck this week. I hope you guys find some good primary source documents. I'm seeing a lot of really good ones, by the way, and I just want to say this last housekeeping thing, and then I'll let you guys go. You guys have had some really good primary source documents. I would also like to see you guys finding some actual documents. I really, really am enjoying some of the primary sources that you guys are finding. But I also want you guys to see written documents too. So journals, diaries, poetry. When I had this class in a physical class, I had my class read Civil War poetry, and it is kind of funny, actually, a lot of it. But you'll see a lot of these sentiments that I talked about earlier in this lecture with the poetry more often than the diaries say. A lot of the Civil War diaries are kind of boring, but in my opinion, most diaries are kind of boring. Look for Civil War cookbooks. Look for political documents. Look for anything that you think might be kind of documentary evidence. I would really like to see that from you guys here coming up. Look for newspaper articles. Newspapers have tons of fabulous information. Songs that are written during the Civil War. There are all kinds of primary sources out there. You guys just have to be a little creative. I know that we've had some Bowie knives here and some Native American skeletons here, and I even had a couple mastodon, which were really, really cool. But try this time to find some actual documents. And for those of you guys who have written about indentures, thank you. I love indentures, and they're so cool. So have a good night, and I will see you guys next week. Bye. Oh, email me if you have any questions. Bye.